Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Max Latona. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Ethics and Society here at St. Anselm College. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today for this talk called Living for Others, Finding Space for Oneself, Insights from Benedictine Spirituality. We have a good mix of people here in the room. I think a few students, a lot of community members, some faculty and staff and members of the monastic community. So welcome all of you. We also have a wonderful online presence. So welcome to all of our online guests. In a moment, I will introduce our speaker, but I just want to take a few minutes just to speak about this program in the center. Today's talk is the second lecture in an ongoing series entitled Ethics and Spirituality, a wisdom lecture series. As some of you know, the Center for Ethics and Society does a good deal of work, both on campus, but also in our communities, in organizations, and other towns and communities throughout the state. We offer research, education, dialogue, and collaboration on issues ranging from the affordable housing crisis to healthcare policy, mental health issues in our communities, but also nonprofit and for-profit board governance, business ethics, and even coming up soon, artificial intelligence. So why are we here doing a talk on Benedictine spirituality? What does that have to do with ethics and society? The reason for this is that at the center, we feel very strongly that while ethics may concern how we act in the world, ethics begins with our individual interior life. It begins with how each of us as individuals interpret life's purpose and meaning, our role in the world, our relationships to ourselves, others, and to God. The great 20th century philosopher Joseph Pieper once wrote that the deeper that our inner life is, that our interiority is, the bigger our world is. That is to say, the greater our awareness of other creatures in the universe. In simpler language, perhaps, the more thoughtful and reflective we become for ourselves, the more we are sensitive to others around us and can treat them with care and respect. So we know that if the center is going to do its work of ethics and society, at least part of what we need to do is to explore some of these fundamental questions that enrich our interior life by providing resources to our communities, to individuals, to thoughtfully grapple with those fundamental questions. Who are we? What is the purpose of life? How should I live and how should I treat others? And more. So where do we find the answers to these questions? Where do we find these resources for living? In truth, there are probably many places we can look to find some guidelines. We can look to the great ethical traditions, to trusted family members and friends. We can pick up many books on the subject of how to live. But what better place to look than the world's great religious and spiritual traditions? What better place to look than those traditions of belief and practice that have helped countless individuals to come to terms with these questions of life's meaning and to cultivate themselves in mind, body, and spirit, and to deepen their bonds with their community and the divine. So the purpose of this lecture series is to invite representatives from these different traditions to come share with us some of their insights and experiences that they've gathered along their own path. Although our invitees often have academic credentials, we have invited them less for those credentials and more for their lived experience. So whether we understand spirituality as deepening our relationship with the divine or growing our compassion for one another, or simply as an awakening of our innermost potential, we can learn from these teachers who have struggled and walked the path before us. And this is the reason for our Ethics and Spirituality lecture series. So our speaker today, Dr. Stefan Reynolds, has come to us all the way from Ireland, and he is someone who has tremendous lived experience. Dr. Stefan Reynolds is the retreat director at Mount Melleray Abbey is that County Waterford, Ireland. He has a PhD from London University in Christian spirituality and 2 MAs in the history of Christianity and in interreligious dialogue. Dr. Reynolds is also the Irish National Coordinator for the Benedictine Oblates, who practice Christian meditation, and he is a lay associate of the Irish Cistercians. An avid author and researcher, Dr. Reynolds serves as the editor of Via Vitae, the Benedictine Oblate newsletter, and has written books on poetry, scripture, and Christian meditation. Two of these titles I have here with me. They include Living with the Mind of Christ, Mindfulness in Christian Spirituality, and The Wisdom of Love in the Song of Songs. These were both gifts to the center from Dr. Stefan Reynolds, thank you. But he also has some copies out on a table near the entranceway. So if anybody would like to procure one, they're available for apparently half price at a very discounted rate. So thank you for that, Dr. Reynolds. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Stefan Reynolds.
So thank you very much for coming, and it's a pleasure to be back here in the USA. I've been here twice serving in universities, first in Arizona State University, where I was working with the Dominican chaplaincy on a program to bring the students out to visit the Native American reservations, which was a wonderful semester I had there. And then a semester at Georgetown in Washington, D.C., where I was director of the John Main Center for Christian Meditation, for Meditation and Interreligious Dialogue. Yeah, we didn't have the Christian part in there because we were trying to do it as an interreligious program. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be back again. And my credentials, you live amongst Benedictines, so that there's many who know much more and live much more than I do, probably. Well, surely. My credentials as a Benedictine go back quite early, though. When I was age 9, a poor little kid, I was sent to a Benedictine boarding school in England and didn't get out of it till I was 18. And then when I went to university, the chaplain in the university was a Benedictine monk. And then when I left university, I went to India and spent time with a Benedictine monastery out there, which was involved with interreligious dialogue. And then I had a break, but did my studies at London mainly with the Jesuits. So, but then I went to Ireland to write. My family has Irish side and an English side, so I was going back to the Irish side, and I got to work at Mount Melleray Abbey while I was writing these two books there, and I've stayed there. So Mount Melleray is a Trappist monastery, so it's a slightly different slant to what I was used to. You're familiar with Trappists here in the US because of Thomas Merton, I guess. They kind of put a big emphasis on manual labor. So when I went there, I was put to as a cleaner. So that was my job. Anyway, it's all very, with the Benedictine life, you kind of learn by, sort of doing the humble tasks. So anyway, there's a picture of Mount Melleray. I got a few pictures just to it's up in the mountains in the Knockmere Downs on the south coast, and it's the first monastery that was built after emancipation. For 300 years they weren't allowed to have monasteries in Ireland. They weren't even allowed to have churches, so they well, Catholics weren't. So they this was the first monastery built in the 1830s. Well, the actual building is a bit later, but the original building goes back to then. And it was a huge monastery in its heyday. Now it is a convent and a monastery. The convent is sort of down the hill, but actually the nuns way outnumber the monks now. We have a flourishing community of nuns, 30, and the monks, I'm afraid, are down to 8. But we have their novices now joining, so it's picking up again. And the Cistercian tradition used to be much more silent and manual labor, not so much into education, although they had a school at Melleray. but it was not the main thing they did. They were great ones for farming, reclaiming land, the Cistercian sort of thing they got. They traditionally took some piece of wasteland and turned it into some marvel. So anyway, Melleray, they were completely self-sustaining there for many years. They had their own electricity they generated. They had their own water supply. They baked their own bread. They made their own clothes, completely self-sustaining, and that kept them busy, as you can imagine. So I've this theme of living for others, finding space for yourself. I've been reflecting on this a bit in the last year. Oh, I didn't mention the most important thing of all. I'm a late marriage. I got married 4 years ago, so that was a big step in life. I kind of, when I was younger, I thought maybe I had a monastic vocation. I was kind of loved monasteries but I never did have the vocation, and it does seem as if it's a vocation rather than a kind of choice. There are many times I could have chosen to have joined, but it didn't seem God called me. Partly because a lot of the monasteries I was involved in were falling apart, so there was nothing much to join. Anyway, God was saving me for marriage, and I'm very happily married, but a late marriage. So and my wife is coming over tomorrow. She's working, so she couldn't come today. So she'll be here for the meditation on Friday. And yeah, why did I add that? Oh yes, the theme, living for others, finding space for yourself. It kind of made me think that might be a good way of understanding the essence of Benedictine spirituality, but also in some ways relevant to married life. You live for the sake of your partner, and yet you need your own space as well. We all need to have our own interests. And I thought it might be one way of going into this balance. Some of the religious orders, like for years I was working with the Jesuits or the Dominicans, their main thing is a sort of mission. So they're out there trying to sort of engage with the world one way or the other. The Benedictine spirituality there's a mission in there, but it's sort of secondary to a lifestyle. And the lifestyle is a generous, warm, hospitable lifestyle, welcoming others, but it's also creating a space where the world or worldly things don't sort of take over. So this is why it sort of creates a rather unique atmosphere. I even picked it up here when I was wandering around this afternoon. There's a sort of unique atmosphere in the Benedictine environment, or Benedictine influenced environment, which has this little taste of what we might call a retreat, this sense of finding space for yourself, rather than being pushed out to engage with the world in different ways always. So maybe that's a special characteristic. The other thing maybe about the Benedictine spirituality is it's a home-making spirituality. That the others orders would be more taking vows of they'd be mission, they'd be going out, and in fact many of them take vows of non-stability. They're basically mendicant. They will not stay in one place for too long, and they think it's not too good to stay in one place for too long. You've got to move on. But the Benedictine spirituality is about making a home and having a family. Really, it's about a family. So in that sense, it's also very relevant to lay people. It's not so much a work spirituality, although work plays an important part, but the primary thing is this is a home, and it's a lot of the rule of St. Benedict is very practical. It's about arranging how to create a home, to be not wasteful, but at the same time not sort of over frugal, get the right balance between availability to others, but at the same time a certain sort of order where things are done at the proper time, so that you're not at the beck and call of everyone at all times. And so in that sense, it's also applicable to how we might create a home. The third thing maybe which distinguishes Benedictines from the other religious orders is maybe the vows. The other orders tend to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But those are not always very easily applicable to lay people in especially householding stage of life, family, marriage. Chastity in marriage, if it's taken too much, is obviously not a good thing. And poverty is not a good thing when you're trying to raise a family or create a house. So actually these vows are not easily applicable to married life. Obedience, well, you see that the Benedictines have that, but if it's only understood as obedience to a religious superior, again, it doesn't really work amongst lay people, because you don't have a religious superior or someone. You might have a boss in the office, but at home it's mutual, the relationship. There's no boss. So or sometimes there is, but we live in the modern world now. So anyway, the Benedictine vows are slightly different. They are stability and obedience and conversatio. There's been a lot of work amongst Benedictine scholars on this last vow. In the old days, it was read as conversio, conversion of life. It was seen more as a sort of spiritual thing about. But modern scholarship has pointed out that all the earliest documents we have of Benedict's rule have actually the word conversatio rather than conversio. And so literally it kind of means a vow of conversation, which you might think is a bit strange. But again, this is sort of relevant to especially family life or home life, stability, sort of staying with relationships, not moving on all the time, sticking with people who life has called you to be with. The obedience, now Benedict's rule makes an emphasis on obedience, which seems to come very much down to listening or attentiveness. There is this aspect of obedience to a superior, that's there, but it's not the whole thing. There's an attentiveness to everyone and a quality of listening, which you see Benedict starts his rule like that. And obedience is mutual. It's not just a hierarchical thing. It's the bit I'll look at in the rule now shows how it's a mutual attentiveness. That's okay. So listening, and then this conversatio, conversation, how important the capacity to share. I mean, technically it might mean sharing in Benedict might have meant it to be sharing in the monastic style of life, but it's sharing a life, basically, that we're not living as individuals, but we're living in a shared life, and all shared life involves conversation. I had to learn this when being a bachelor for many years and then getting married. You have to discuss everything, and nothing can be kind of assumed anymore at all. So anyway, this vow of conversatio, things have to be discussed, and conversation helps to bring things out as well. So the combination of listening and communicating is really what a relationship is about, and stability. So really the Benedictine vows are a vow to be with others. You might see the essentially relational, being, stability, and to be with someone you need to listen, and you need to also be able to communicate. So it's very universal, really, not specifically religious in any sense. So, I haven't shown any slides. Oh yeah, and this is I forgot about the slide. This is your famous Trappist anyway, Thomas Merton. Again, how this finding space for yourself, this element of retreat, which is always in the Benedictine spirituality, is not a sort of standoffishness or a kind of closing off from others, but is actually a way of opening to others. Thomas Merton went at the end of his life to this hermitage. He was an unusual Trappist, I must say, after living with Trappists for a long time. Kind of realized how Merton's certainly not the usual Trappist. They're more definitely more intellectual than most. They're more kind of complex. But anyway, he went off to his hermitage. But he says here that there's times of solitude and silence, where he finds the gentleness with which I can truly love my brother and sister. Yeah. So the times of silence are where we learn how to love in those by making time for ourselves. If we're just rushing out to the beck and call of others, then we might not learn the real heart of love, which involves having space for yourself. Not a monastic, but another religious says much the same thing, that in silence, which we receive in prayer, that's what we can give in the active life. So because God can act through us. I prepared a long speech here, actually, with lots of details on Benedict's rule, but then I went for a walk in the beautiful woods here, and I suddenly thought, well, this is all too much. I should just talk about something which is a bit more relevant. So, so a bit like that. If we have a bit of silence, then we kind of get a bit of a perspective on what's important for others. And Benedict spent he was an unusual monk as well. Benedict was an unusual Benedictine because he started as a hermit. In his rule, he says you should end as a hermit, not start as one. But Benedict himself started as a hermit and then went on to live in community. So this is from the life of St. Benedict, written by Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory, who wrote it sort of, I don't know, a generation or two after Benedict's death. But he records what Benedict's disciples said. And it says that Benedict lived alone with himself under the gaze of God. So this is the solitary life, the hermit life, where you have time to have time for yourself, but in the presence of God. And this is in Subiaco. May have been there. Yeah. This is also Gregory the Great, because he asks, what does it mean to be alone with? What does it mean to have time for yourself? And he basically says it's to not be drawn out of yourself by too much mental agitation, to be peaceful, just peaceful with God. So Gregory the Great says, every time we are drawn out of ourselves by too much mental agitation, we are not with ourselves, even though we think we are, because we wander here and there in our minds and we do not see ourselves. So the finding space, time for yourself, doesn't necessarily mean thinking a lot. It can just mean being still and letting the mind become still. We'll talk about this more on Friday and the meditation time we here. It's more about just being still and in the presence of God. As the psalm says, be still and know that I am God. In the stillness we know God. We don't necessarily, I don't want to be anti-theologians, but we don't necessarily know God through thinking about God, but through stillness, yeah, and we're pretty sure we will know God. And the aspects of the rule emphasize this sort of stability where we're present. The porter of the monastery. The porter is an important character in the monastery because it's the interface between the home and the outside world, and all of us have this sort of interface between the two. You might say the interface between the finding space for yourself at home and the living for others outside. And the porter has to kind of be that person who's sort of at the meeting place, and their role is to be very welcoming. In fact, Benedict in his rule says that the porter should have a room, we assume even a bedroom, because he says because people arrive at all times, unpredictable times, he better have a room there. So he's always there to welcome. But he also says that the porter, it would be quite good to be an old man who wouldn't be prone to wandering around too much. Someone. So, yeah, but also to be there present. When I was at one stage at Melleray, I was porter. They call it. It wasn't porter; it was an official role. I was working at reception. That's what they call it, reception. So I was sitting at the desk, but I was writing these books. So I was a very bad porter because every time a guest come, I was like, oh no, I'm be in the middle of some important sentence, and someone would turn up asking for something. And so anyway, really the account of the porter is that they immediately leap up, and the guest is much more important than anything else. Yeah. And then at the same time, just the other balance, this openness to others, which is represented by the porter or by the reception of guests, is balanced by a kind of self-sufficiency within the monastery, whereby they wouldn't necessarily need to go out a lot. And this is again something you can learn at home life, maybe limiting the amount of times we have to go out shopping by sort of arranging one shop for the week and then keeping it at that, or growing your own vegetables, which I do now. Somehow kind of limiting the necessity to go out all the time every 5 minutes to get something, because it says that the monastery, the Benedict says, the monastery should, if possible, be so constructed that within it all the necessities can be found, and he lists all the things, so that there will be no need for monks to roam about outside to get things. So it's self-sufficient. Yes, this openness to the world, and yet kind of preserving one's inner peace, a certain sort of safeguarding of peace. So the rule at a number of points makes this thing about how we have to be hospitable, welcoming, and at the same time we have to kind of not get over attached. So even if there's a guest coming, you welcome them, the whole community goes out to welcome them and everything. But then a particular person is given charge of looking after them, a particular room, quarters are given to them, and that from then on the monks are not actually even allowed to chat to the guests, because it would kind of disturb the normal life of the monastery. So maybe even when we have guests, like I have a house in Ireland and we have guests, to be very welcoming when people arrive, but also let people have their own space, even guests, to have some time for themselves and things. so that we don't need to be constantly, because you can get worn out by having guests all the time, sort of to even make sure that we can still lead our ordinary lives. Yeah. Anyway, this is the Trappists who they tend to be more silent Benedictines. They take the vow of silence, so they use sign language a lot. So, but anyway, Benedict says that the preserve times for silence. So this is important for practices like meditation, to preserve times during the day when we might take time of silence, not over absorbing the news, for example, which can be very disturbing. I mean, it's sometimes good to know and to be disturbed because we want to pray about it and hold it in our hearts, but to hang on the news all the time without having these sort of times of when we can just get away is not very helpful. As Benedict says, you need times when you refrain from words, even good words. And prayer, that the prayer for the Benedictine is not necessary, although they have these liturgies and things. Benedict says the heart of prayer is not in the words; it's in a simple, pure heart, purity of heart. Oh yeah. So I'll stick to Benedict a bit more. So the bit I wanted to look at, and I think I will use it, is right at the second penultimate chapter of the rule, which is chapter 72. And I've been reading recently, commentaries now see this as the sort of culmination of the rule, where Benedict's really tried to sum up what he's trying to get at by people living in community. And it's in an earlier chapter, chapter 7, he's summed up what the individual path is. It's called the steps of humility, and there's 12 steps. And you climb these steps as an individual. And but here in this final chapter, he's kind of saying that in the end, it's not really for yourself that you're doing this. You're doing it for the sake of others. And this other-centeredness comes in at the end of the rule to say all these the spiritual practice is there to develop this, what he calls a good zeal. And he contrasts this with what he calls a bitter zeal. And a bitter zeal is where he takes the actual phrase from the letter of St. James, where in St. James says, do not harbor bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts. So this notion that we're trying to do better than others, and we're comparing ourselves with others. That's what jealousy is. So here he's countering that with a kind of a good zeal, because he could see that if you do spiritual practice, you might end up thinking, oh, I'm better than people. Or you might think, oh, I'm worse than, I'm hopeless at this. I can't be a contemplative. Those monks are the only people who can do it, and then you don't do anything. So instead of comparing yourself to others, is to find what he calls the good zeal. And again, he takes this from the letter of St. James, when St. James gives a list of what he calls the wisdom that comes from above: pure, peace-loving, gentle, accommodating, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. But Benedict gives a little twist to this by saying that the most important thing in the good zeal is warmth of heart, warm love. He says all these other things that St. James lists are great, but the real key to good zeal is warmth of heart. So he says, this is what he says in chapter 72. Monastics should practice, and we might say here, any meditator or contemplative should practice this zeal with the warmest love. Let them strive to be the first to honor one another. They should bear one another's weaknesses of both body and character with the utmost patience. They must compete with one another in obedience. No one should pursue what they judge as best for themselves, but rather what benefits others. It's quite a simple little thing, and just of being open-hearted and generous, but there's a lot in it. The first one, to honor one another. We do it in the marriage vows, to honor the person we're marrying. And we don't often think about what that means. There's also the fourth commandment, isn't it? Or the fifth, honor your mother and father. There's a certain affection in honor. Sometimes we think it's just a sort of respect, but there's much more affection in honor than respect. There is respect involved in this as well, but there's a certain affection. That's why it's used for parents, for our partners. But Benedict says, honor all people. Actually, in the Tools of Good Works, which is earlier in the rule, he says, honor all people. So that affection and respect we might have for those closest to us, we should also show that same affection and respect to everybody we meet. Sort of, it means that it's coming from from the warmth of affection. To bear one another's weaknesses of both body and character with utmost patience. Well, that's a summing up of married life. So, yeah. Yeah. To bear one another, yes, love is patient, St. Paul says. Love is patient. And everyone has their strengths and weaknesses, but by learning our own weaknesses as well of body and character and being patient with those. And learning to live within our weaknesses. I was saying yesterday, I can't eat the gluten for some reason. I keep on saying to myself, oh, come on, you can eat gluten. Don't be one of these fussy characters. And then and then I go out and eat gluten and I get ill. And then I never seem to learn. I always go back. So now I'm making a thing. And this is my weakness. This is the fragility somehow I've been given. And I have to live within that fragility and be patient with it, and other people have to be patient. So so love is patient, and then that same patience we have with other people's needs. In the rule of St. Benedict, there's a big section on care for the sick, and he says this is the biggest priority in the monastery, is care for the sick, and because there we learn this patience, and we learn love through caring for other people's in their vulnerability. And the next one is they must compete with one another in obedience. You might think that's a bit of a strange thing to compete with obedience, but it's basically a mutual obedience. This is what I was trying to get at. The difference between obedience in the Benedictine thing, although it's fair enough, I don't want to exaggerate that too much, but there is a big sense that it's really about listening. And the idea is that, and this is explained in other Cassian, who was Benedict's teacher, that God is more likely to speak to us through the advice of another person than through our own insights. That's what Cassian says. And we often think, I don't need to listen. Like my wife was saying the other day when I was coming here, she was saying, oh, you have to get health insurance if you go to America, because they'll charge you an arm and a leg if you lose an arm and a leg. And then I was thinking, oh, I don't need health insurance because I don't need to go to the doctor very often. So it was all ridiculous. And then, but then I remembered this passage that, and so so it's more like kind of, if someone advises you something, listen to it. Don't just presume, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. I know better. Because God is more likely to speak to us through the advice of another than through our own insights. So we shouldn't consider ourselves so wise. And also, even this is what Cassian says, even those who we might consider not particularly wise, God could use them. God doesn't necessarily only use people who, like our spiritual directors or the people we might expect, but anyone who says, like Hannah said, oh, do you want to show some slides? I had no intention to show any slides. And I thought, okay, maybe that's a bit of advice from God. So I cobbled together a few slides, just to, if I got too boring, people could look at the slides. So that's what I mean about. I'm not saying that Hannah is necessarily an example of someone who's not very wise, and therefore you wouldn't expect wise advice to come from them. But the main thing Benedict says is compete with everyone. So within a monastery, you can imagine the spectrum of wisdom is quite varied. But everyone, there's no obedience to everyone, even the one who you might not expect to get anything from. And then the last one is, and no one should pursue what they judge as advantageous for themselves, but rather what benefits others. And again, this is, you might think, quite simple. Yeah, again, St. Paul makes the same statements in a way. Love, in Corinthians, love does not seek its own interests. But Benedict puts an emphasis on two things. One, judgment. No one should pursue what they consider, what they judge best for them, but what they judge best for another. So there's a sense of discerning what is, where's the thing? There's a discerning what is actually best for the other person. It's not just pleasing them. And also the word that Benedict uses, utile, he uses. What is utile for another person? That means useful, or as here's translated, advantageous. So he doesn't say necessarily do what the other person wants, or do, although that would be part of obedience, and it's normally the most obvious part of obedience, do the washing up. Okay, I'll do the washing up, that kind of thing. But there's also a sense of discerning what is useful for another person. So it means really getting to know someone and discerning how they can grow. Again, this is a part of the marriage vows to help mutual growth. And if someone needs a rest, you discern that they need a rest, and you give them a rest and whatever. And if someone needs, so it's a relational thing rather than just people pleasing. We might think it's just not just doing what pleases the other person, but no, it's what's useful, what really is useful for the other person. So that's that end of the rule of St. Benedict gives this sense of this warm-heartedness, this generosity of spirit, which is what the whole purpose of it is. But the living out of that involves taking space for yourself also. This warm-heartedness is lived out. I've shown you how it's lived out in the gatekeeper or the porter of the monastery, in the receiving of guests. It's also expressed most clearly in the abbot. Oh, the carers for the sick, they have that. But the abbot is someone who is the rule says this, the abbot is to adapt with sympathetic understanding, serving the needs of so many different characters. You might say difficult characters as well, but different. So is to discern what people need and what is helpful for a person. So the abbot is someone who's really caring and kind of really. So maybe these qualities we have to learn for ourselves. There's certain points we're all as a layperson, we have to find the abbot within, really, the one who can do that role to help other people to and adapt to the requirements of other people. And the last one, the example is the cellarer. The cellarer is someone who looks after the possessions of the monastery, the goods, and this is to be someone who takes care of things and takes care of the way that he responds to requests. So care and concern for the sick, for children, for guests, for the poor, and for the objects themselves. He says, regarding utensils and goods as if they were sacred vessels of the altar. So this is a sort of care, a sort of mindfulness, is the modern world, about people and about things, and using them in a as best way as we can. Anyway, so I wanted to, because I promised to say something about Ireland, I will return for the last few minutes to talk a bit about monasticism in Ireland. What is the quality of monasticism in Ireland? Well, one of the things is, because monasticism was stamped out at the end of the Middle Ages in Ireland and wasn't allowed to return until the 19th century, is that when it came back, it had the glory days of Irish monasticism were these early centuries, the 7th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, until the Vikings came and started to destroy it. But from the 5th century, from the time of St. Patrick, you got sort of monasteries growing all over Ireland. It was a sort of, the town where I live was a huge monastery, and universities is wrong. It was a monastic school because universities hadn't started, but it was these sort of were growing up all over Ireland in those days. And the distinctiveness of the Celtic spirituality was such that they lived very close to nature, partly because of the conditions of the time. This was not a very developed sort of materially, the society. So they had to live very close to nature, and they got to know God through their contact with nature. And maybe that was something that the Irish monasticism kind of remembers, because it didn't have those later developments which the rest of continental Europe had, where they were able to develop big monasteries. They weren't big sort of grand monasteries with sort of choirs and things like that. It was always very simple and close to nature. So St. Patrick's prayer is rather unique. You wouldn't even expect that sense that God is in nature and yeah, it's remarkable. That, and I think that's the distinctive characteristic of Irish spirituality. I rise today through the strength of heaven, the light of the sun, the radiance of the moon, the splendor of fire, the speed of lightning, the swiftness of wind, the depth of the sea, the stability of the earth, the firmness of rock. It's a very distinctive spirituality. You could hardly expect it anywhere else, but it's a gift which they give us. And it's sometimes seen in the landscape. I mean, a beautiful landscape here, but the Celtic cross has this cross and this circle. The cross is within a cosmic vision. The circle is the sort of cosmic cycle, the cycles of nature. and the cross is within that. It's a very distinctive cross. Again, you wouldn't find it anywhere else. The closeness to the ocean, well, you have it here as well. In fact, if you went through that hole and just kept going, you'd probably arrive at Boston. And they lived in in these windswept places on the coast. This is Skelligs off the Kerry coast. And then they sometimes even that wasn't isolated or vulnerable enough to them. They like to put themselves in vulnerable conditions where where they were battered by the elements. So they would set off in boats, like Brendan the navigator, and sail off into the middle of nowhere, and maybe discover Newfoundland or wherever he was supposed to have discovered. Yeah, it was way before any of these other explorers from Spain ever dreamt of it. This is Skelligs, where you go up. So they live in these rugged places, and as you see, the monasteries were very simple, just these sort of huts. But because monasticism was then stopped, it kind of nothing else. The grand monasticism never developed. So we always look back to this as the glory day, and it was in many ways. And view from Skelligs onto Kerry, and they were deeply in touch with the desert tradition. That's the bit of the talk I left out, the desert fathers and mothers from Egypt. But you get in the Celtic crosses pictures of St. Anthony of the Desert and St. Paul of Thebes, the first two monks, often depicted. So they were in touch with this this tradition, which is at the root of Benedictine spirituality, but is also at the root of other forms of monasticism, like the Orthodox spirituality of the Orthodox monks, and the Celtic monks, who were not following the rule of St. Benedict out here, but they were drawing from the same root, the desert fathers and mothers of Egypt. And then when they did develop this glorious tradition, it came out in manuscripts rather than architecture. So they would live in rather simple buildings, but develop these beautiful manuscripts like the Book of Kells. Yeah. Very Irish looking Christ there. Maybe it isn't Christ, actually. I think it's Moses, isn't it? With his arms being held up. Not sure. Christ on the left, but. And this is one of the evangelists. It may be Luke. We might have it. Not sure. It's his feast day today, so we'll say it is. But the sorts of decoration, they kind of went for the small rather than the big. If you look at monasticism in France, they would be building these great sort of monasteries, and like a Cluny or whatever. But here there would be tiny little manuscripts. And then this mission, this sailing off. The Irish have always been leaving their land, and they would go off throughout Europe to found monasteries. I hear that your centre here is doing a tour of the Danube next year, and we'll be visiting monasteries like Melk and things. All these monasteries were founded by Irish monks. All these monasteries, and these are the great monasteries of the later Middle Ages, all had their origins by some eccentric wandering monk. So that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
So we have a few minutes for questions for Dr. Reynolds.
Hi, I'm just curious about how.
Oh, you have to wait for the microphone so people on. online.
Sorry. Hi, I'm just curious about how this, the lessons understood from, this lecture as well as the Benedictine tradition in general can be more applied to the life of the layperson, specifically in regards to better understanding and interacting with the faith in movements such as, lay fraternities or lay orders such as the Opus Dei, Knights of Columbus and stuff like that. So I'm just wondering how integrating these what integrating these ideas looks like in a day-to-day lifestyle, sort of.
Yeah, I'd say the Benedictine thing is about a contemplative sort of basis for all the other things. So you can have your involvements in all these other groups, but there would be basically a practice of silent prayer would be included as a sort of that would be the distinctive Benedictine aspect of your life, maybe. So all these other things can also be there, and they can be enriched by that practice. But to have a certain part of every day where you would just be with God, and then live for others. But you need to have that bit of the day where you're just you and God, and nothing else.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments? I think we might have something online.
Thank you. This question is from Leah online. The question is, why do you think the rule of Benedict has had such lasting power and remained relevant and used by monasteries for 1500 years?
Yeah. Well, it was kind of one amongst many rules. The Irish monks had their own rules, the rule of Columbanus and things like that. And then the Orthodox monks have their rule, the rule of St. Basil. And there were other rules on the continent, the rule of the master and things. In the 9th century, under Charlemagne, the emperor, he tried to unify all the monasteries. And he said that the best way to get everyone working together, when you have an empire, it's much better to get everyone doing the same thing. That's what empires do, is to get them all to follow the same rule. So the rule of St. Benedict was chosen, and during the reforms in the 9th century on the continent, and came to Ireland at that time. But why was the rule of Benedict chosen? It could have chosen one of the others and then made everyone follow that. But there's a certain balance in the rule of St. Benedict and a sort of adaptability to it. For example, the rule of St. Columbanus, if you read it, would seem quite extreme if compared to the rule of Benedict. A lot of fasting, a lot of penances, and make you somewhat ill-adapted to the requirements of normal life. So whereas Benedict's rule is quite moderate. So I suppose that's one of the things. Yeah, I suppose that's it. And there's a warmth to the Benedict's rule. There's not comparing it to the rule of the master, which is Benedict uses, but he kind of gives these little human touches, which sort of makes it much more less austere than some of these other rules. I don't know the rules in Basil. There's that would be an interesting study, what the Orthodox monks follow. Yeah. But it's in the West, it's became pretty much the only monastic rule until there were adaptations in the Middle Ages. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Hi, on Friday, are you going to give us a practical way to begin a day and take what we've just gleaned from you today and go forth in our lives?
Yeah, I think Friday we focus on the meditation practice, which is a very important part of, yeah. And I think we'll have a time of actual silence and guidance of how we can use that. Yeah. So Benedict, it is an important element, but it's not the prayer, and then this sort of kind of living out through the ordinary things of life. That's the nice thing about the rule as well. In many ways, if you read it, it doesn't come across, there's spiritual sort of bits to it, but a lot of it's very practical. And Benedict kind of says that we come to God through just living the ordinary practical things of life, which are things that we have to do. Nothing particularly sort of supernatural about it. So, but yes, the meditation is an important part. Yes, yeah. So we'll look at that specifically on Friday.
You need the microphone.
Sorry. So if we continue to practice on a daily basis, will we see fruits from that practice?
Oh yes, I think so. Yes. Yeah. I mean the way to be still. I mean, you get benefits. WCCM language of Christian meditation. You get benefits, which is kind of obvious. You get to relax. You get less stressed. You get a sort of clearer mind. Like I went for a lovely walk here, and then realized what I'd written was a lot of unnecessary stuff. So you just get a clearer mind, and you kind of start to see what's the heart, what really needs to be done in the moment. So yeah, those sort of benefit, and then the fruits of the Spirit. That's what you start: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, generosity, and self-control. That's what comes out of it. Yeah. And it does, because God gives it, like Mother Teresa said there, it's not really what we do, it's what God does through us. So by giving that space to God, just giving a bit of time to God and being still, then God can work those things through us. Yeah.
We have another question.
Thank you, Stefan. Just had a question about the kind of more modern understanding of contemplation as not being a higher stage of spirituality they have to work up to, but it's accessible to children even. I wonder if you could say a word about that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the Benedict in his rule has children in the monastery, and and definitely it's this sense that children can be great teachers of. I don't actually have children myself, so but I'm for my nieces and nephews. They can be great teachers of being in the present moment, so that we can learn that from them. And they seem to take to meditation. For those who do meditation teaching in the schools, they seem to take to it. Yeah, in terms of I think so that it's also the learning, because the other thing about the Benedictine thing, Benedict went to university, you might say, in Rome. He actually went there for his studies, and then he kind of dropped out. He was a dropout, and he said but Gregory the Great, who became Pope and is called Great, said that he was wisely unlearned. So that actually the wisdom that you get from life, it can be much more important than the wisdom we learn in education. I don't want to be putting down in this institution anyway, but the Benedict himself was kind of trying to learn through life, rather than learning. So in that sense, all people can be take to meditation. You don't need to be clever in any sense at all.
So would you say that like the meditation you're talking about for part of a day would be anything like kind of almost like being a hermit for and kind of functioning as a hermit for a small part of the day without being a hermit for 24/7 like Benedict was?
Yeah, that's definitely, the hermit life is sort of always there in monasticism, even though they may live, and Benedict is regulating for community, but it's always there in the background, and as a very precious aspect of life, because in the end there's a solitude, as Thomas Merton says, there's a deep and fruitful loneliness within every one of us. Deep and fruitful, so that if we can touch that fruitfulness of that solitude, because there's only one of us in the world, so just to be our unique selves is to be on our own.
Okay, I just have one follow-up question myself. You mentioned some of the fruits of finding space for yourself or stillness, and one of them you mentioned was self-discipline. I think that was the last in a long list of fruits that you mentioned. Can you explain just briefly how silence or stillness or spending time by yourself actually bears the fruit of self-discipline?
Well, it's a kind of I don't know. In my life, I have this sort of just do it motto, which is kind of like, maybe it's a Jesuit influence, but it's like sometimes I worry about things and I think I should be, and then meditation, when I sit to meditate, I just sit, and I actually have a practice using a prayer word, so I just say my prayer word, I just do it, and then I don't have any particular expectations that anything will happen. I just do it, and then I get up, and then I just do the things I have to do. I just do it, and that's the sort of discipline, in the sense that you just get on with things. And it's quite helpful when I have to tidy the house, because the house can get in a real mess, and then I'm like, oh, what am I going to do? And then I just do it. And I just get up and tidy. I go from one room to the next, tidy. And this sort of sense of tidying up, that sort of kind of keeping things in good order, that kind of stuff, which is maybe I learn because I'm not naturally like that at all. I'm pretty scruffy. So it's kind of like I learn it through the meditation practice, just being able to get on with doing something very simple, without without being annoyed by having to do something.
I like the analogy of ethics as keeping your life tidy. Thank you very much for your words today, and thank you all of you for attending. I will invite you to join us on Friday at 12:30 in the event center, the Gene Student Center event space, for Practice of Christian Meditation, an introductory workshop by Dr. Stefan Reynolds. And again, there are some books out on the table there that he wrote. If you'd be interested, you could speak with him about how to pay for them. But I want to thank all of you for coming today for our Wisdom Lecture Series and for listening to Dr. Stefan Reynolds, and have a good evening.